The air in the chamber was thin, tasting of burnt wax and stagnant dust. Charles II lay propped against a stack of pillows, his chest rising in sharp, uneven stutters. Each breath was a labor. He clawed at the bedsheets, his knuckles white, but the effort yielded nothing but a rattling sound in his throat. The physician stood to his left, eyes fixed on the monarch's face, his hand trembling as he reached for a basin of water. He wiped a bead of sweat from his own brow, then turned his gaze toward the window. There was no sound from the city, only the flicker of candles casting long, jagged shadows against the stone walls. The physician looked back at the king, noting the set of his jaw, a feature that had defined his ancestors for generations, but now served only as a testament to their decline. Charles II was 38 years old, yet his skin hung loose against his frame like parchment stretched over dry wood. He was a man trapped within the architecture of his own lineage, a final, fragile vessel for a dynasty that had run out of time. He turned his head, his eyes searching the dark corners of the room for a comfort that was no longer there. Beyond the thick stone walls of the palace, the city of Madrid was waking to a different rhythm. A single bell struck, its iron tongue resonant and heavy, vibrating through the cold morning air. Then a second, and a third. The tolling was slow, deliberate, and devoid of the frantic energy of a call to arms or the sharp peal of a royal wedding. It was a funeral cadence, a sound that forced passers-by in the streets to pause, look up, and listen to the finality echoing across the plazas. Men in the markets stopped their haggling. Guards at the gates tightened their grips on their spears, staring toward the palace towers where the banners hung limp against the gray sky. There was no joy in the sound, no celebration of power. The rhythm was a countdown, a metallic heartbeat announcing that the era of the Habsburgs was hemorrhaging its final moments. Every strike of the hammer against the bronze casing deepened the atmosphere of dread. The air in the streets grew still, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for the news that would shatter the status quo. It was the sound of a dynasty unraveling, broadcast to every corner of the capital. The physician stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He did not look at the bed hangings or the flickering lamps. His attention remained locked on the sovereign. He reached out, his fingers hovering momentarily before he tilted the king's chin to better catch the light. The lower jaw sat heavy, thrusting outward in a rigid, unnatural protrusion that made closing the mouth a constant struggle. It was a signature, a biological mark carved into the bone by centuries of repetition. The physician pulled his hand back, wiping the sweat from his brow with a damp cloth, his pulse quickening. He had studied the portraits in the gallery, the long, heavy faces of ancestors who shared this same structural distortion. Looking at the king now, the physician saw not just a man, but the final, brittle result of a long-standing family design. The air around the bed seemed to grow colder. Every shallow, rattling breath the monarch took felt like a ticking clock, echoing the slow, inevitable disintegration of a lineage that had finally run its course. He turned away, unable to mask the tremor in his hands, fully aware that no medicine could rewrite the history embedded in the king's own skull. The silence in the royal chamber signaled more than the end of a life. It marked the collapse of a central authority. Charles II left no direct heir to secure the succession, leaving the crown sitting as a hollow, gilded prize on the velvet cushion. For decades, the empire had stood as a monolith, but now the cracks were visible to every court in Europe. Across the borders, the political landscape shifted instantly. Rival houses that had long been suppressed by Spanish reach now sensed the weakness. They moved like shadows across a map, calculating the division of territories, provinces, and gold. The throne room, once the heart of a global power, felt cavernous and abandoned. Diplomats sent urgent dispatches to their sovereigns, their ink barely dry before the next courier arrived with news of the king's failing pulse. The vultures were gathering. Every movement in the nearby capitals was timed to the anticipated collapse of the Spanish administration. There was no successor to rally the troops or command the loyalty of the governors. The empire, which had once dictated the terms of international order, was now a carcass waiting to be carved. The walls of the palace seemed to shrink, trapping the history of a dying dynasty inside while the world outside prepared to dismantle its legacy piece by piece. To understand the hollow shell left in Madrid, one must travel back 2 centuries to the rise of the Habsburg ambition. History often records the thunder of cannons and the movement of infantry, but the architects of this dynasty chose a different weapon. In the 16th century, Emperor Maximilian I looked at the map of Europe and saw a board for a different kind of game. He issued a command that would define his house for generations. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It was a calculated pivot. Where other monarchs exhausted their treasuries on sieges and scorched earth campaigns, Maximilian invested in the ink of marriage contracts. He treated bloodlines as strategic assets, merging families to acquire land without shedding a drop of his own soldiers' sweat. It seemed an act of genius at the time, a way to stitch together a sprawling world through simple vows. Yet, in that very pursuit of acquisition, a dangerous precedent was set. By turning inward to preserve the concentration of power, they started a cycle that would eventually strip them of their own vitality. The policy that once built the foundation of their dominance was, in truth, the first step toward the ruin that now haunted the chamber of Charles II. The strategy proved devastatingly effective. Provinces were treated as currency, traded across the continent with the calculated precision of a card game, where a general would demand a decade of siege. The Habsburgs simply demanded a signature on a wedding document. They stitched together a tapestry of territories that spanned the globe, connecting lands that had never shared a border or a tongue. From the fertile plains of the Netherlands to the rugged mountain passes of the Italian peninsula, the map of their influence expanded with every union. This was not the slow grind of conquest. It was the rapid accumulation of sovereignty through alliances. They built a multi-continental machine, linking colonies in the distant Americas to the power centers of Central Europe. Each marriage added a new layer to the map, a new tax base, a new source of raw wealth. The scale of their ambition was staggering. They saw themselves as the architects of a permanent order, a family that would eventually encompass the entire known world through the simple, binding force of the vow. The empire stretched across oceans and hemispheres, growing so vast that it seemed impossible for it ever to shrink. It was the apex of their power, a sprawling, interconnected web of holdings that defied the traditional limits of royal reach. Success brought a new, cold fear. As the empire reached its zenith, the Habsburgs looked at their sprawling map and saw not opportunity, but vulnerability. They became obsessed with the borders they had created, gripped by the terror that a single foreign marriage would bleed their holdings dry. If a daughter married a prince from a rival house, the dowry would vanish into a foreign treasury. If a title crossed a border, the land might be lost to a neighbor. The geopolitical logic that once drove them to conquer now forced them to retreat into a defensive crouch. They began to view every outside alliance as a potential fracture in their foundation. The vast, interconnected world they had built started to feel like a liability. To protect the integrity of their estates, they stopped looking outward for partners and began scanning their own family tree. Every province, every city, and every ton of gold became a reason to tighten the circle. The open, expansive ambition of the previous century withered. In its place grew a suffocating need for control, a desire to seal the gates and keep their power contained. They were no longer building an empire. They were guarding a vault. The walls of their world were closing in, and the dynasty began to suffocate under the weight of its own protection. The solution to their paranoia was found in the family ledger. To keep the gold, the land, and the titles from drifting into rival hands, the Habsburgs restricted marriage to the narrowest possible circle. Cousins married cousins. Uncles wed nieces. Every wedding became an act of fortification, a legal maneuver designed to ensure that not a single acre of territory or ounce of bullion escaped the family vault. They treated their own bloodline as a restricted asset class, carefully managed and guarded from the outside world. This obsession with purity turned every union into a transaction of total retention. Property lines were erased as estates merged back into the central coffers. The wealth of entire regions was locked behind a gate that only family members could open. Yet, as the vault grew heavier with gold, the psychological cost began to manifest. They were no longer engaging with the world. They were hoarding it. The very policies intended to secure their legacy transformed into a cage of their own making. Every marriage certificate was a padlock, and every child born of these unions was a prisoner of the strategy. They had secured the vault, but in doing so, they had trapped themselves inside, unaware that the air was beginning to run thin. The family tree ceased to be a record of growth and became a map of contraction. It folded in on itself, branch by branch, until the connections blurred into a tight, inescapable knot. No new blood entered. No new perspective was permitted to challenge the status quo. The dynasty grew obsessed with its own reflection, constantly reinforcing the same traits, the same names, and the same narrow lineage. This was no longer a legacy. It was a closed circuit. As the generations progressed, the lines of descent grew increasingly jagged, doubling back and crossing until the family chart resembled a spider's web. The space between members vanished. Each union tightened the tension, pulling the threads of their history until the structure itself began to strain under the pressure. Outside the palace walls, the world moved forward, diversified, and evolved. Inside, the Habsburgs remained static, locked in a cycle of repetition that narrowed their genetic horizon with every passing year. They were building a labyrinth where every corridor led back to the same origin point. The web was not just growing, it was constricting. By limiting their reach to the familiar, they had ensured that their world would never again expand. It would only continue to fold, layer upon layer, until the boundaries of their reality were too small to sustain the weight of their own history. The theoretical obsession with purity finally demanded a physical sacrifice. Philip II stood before the altar, not to secure a kingdom, but to solidify the bloodline through the union with his niece, Anna of Austria. This was the moment the strategy crossed a point of no return. By binding his own house to the next generation of his kin, he pushed the family into a zone of genetic isolation that had no exit. The ink on the marriage contract was barely dry before the structural integrity of the dynasty began to show signs of strain. It was a calculated risk that ignored the basic laws of biology in favor of dynastic retention. With this singular act, the family stopped growing and began to consume itself. The immediate effect was subtle, yet the shift in the genetic trajectory was absolute. They had traded long-term vitality for the short-term comfort of total control. As the union was sealed, the internal clock of the Habsburgs began to tick faster, moving toward an inevitable collapse. Every subsequent generation would now carry the weight of this decision. As the path toward instability became a permanent descent, they had broken the seal of diversity, and the irreversible consequences were already set into motion, waiting to manifest in the lives of those yet to be born. The precedent set by the predecessors became a rigid law for the house. Philip IV looked at the family archive and saw only one path forward. He chose to repeat the era, wedding his own niece, Mariana. This was not merely a diplomatic arrangement. It was a deliberate narrowing of the bloodline. With every signature on these marriage documents, the possibility of genetic renewal vanished. The family had moved beyond the point of simple influence and into a state of biological stagnation. This decision transformed the dynasty into a machine of self-replication. By linking uncle to niece, they effectively locked the doors of their own future. Each generation now mirrored the last with terrifying precision. As the same traits and the same weaknesses were reinforced, never diluted by outside blood, the trap was set. The pattern was now so deeply entrenched that no other option existed within their worldview. As the vows were exchanged, the final gears of the dynasty's decline clicked into place. The stage was being cleared for the birth of an heir who would carry the full weight of these accumulated unions. Every action taken by the court now served only to accelerate the inevitable. The cycle had been perfected, and in its perfection, it became the architect of their total collapse. The final result of the cycle arrived in the year 1661. When the child was born, the court expected the continuation of a legacy, but the math of the bloodline had already dictated a different outcome. Charles II entered the world with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. This number was not just a statistic, it was the biological equivalent of a sibling's offspring, a concentration of traits that defied the survival patterns of any healthy house. The shock of this reality hit the palace like a thunderbolt. Centuries of careful, calculated marriages had distilled the family legacy into a single point of extreme vulnerability. There was no room for error, yet the error was now encoded into every cell of the new monarch. The dynastic goal of hoarding power through blood had reached its absolute catastrophic limit. By closing the door to outside influence, they had forced the genetic code to fold in on itself until it reached a breaking point. The reality of this birth signaled the end of the dynasty's viability. The throne was now occupied by a life defined by the very strategy meant to secure its eternal dominance. It was a point of no return. The house had finally succeeded in purifying its blood, only to find that in doing so, they had erased their future. The truth of the bloodline was no longer hidden in records. It was displayed on canvas for all to see. Royal painters sat in the palace, tasked with capturing the sovereign, but their brushes told a story the court tried to ignore. Year after year, the portraits documented a steady, relentless physical decline. The lower jaw pushed forward, heavy and rigid, anchoring a face that grew longer with every passing decade. The lower lip hung slack, unable to hold a natural shape. Across the room, onlookers watched the eyes of the monarch. In the earliest paintings, they possessed a spark of life, but as the years progressed, that light dimmed. The vitality faded, replaced by a dull, unfocused gaze that stared out from the frame. This was not a sudden change, but a slow, frame-by-frame erosion of the human form. Every portrait served as a ledger of the family's internal decay. The artists did not hide the truth. They recorded the transformation of the dynasty into a shadow of its former self. By placing these works side by side, the observers saw the rot manifest in real time. The jaw, the lips, and the dimming eyes became the final, brutal evidence that the bloodline had exhausted its capacity to sustain a healthy existence. The rot was not limited to the faces of the living. It claimed the future before it could even begin. Inside the palace, the nursery became a site of relentless tragedy. Queen after queen arrived with the promise of an heir, yet the cradle remained empty, or served only as a temporary resting place for the frail. Doctors recorded the sequence of losses with clinical detachment. A premature birth, a sudden fever, a fragile heartbeat that simply ceased in the middle of the night. No amount of gold, no prayer, and no decree could reverse the damage done by the bloodline. The court watched as these tiny lives flickered out, one by one. The frequency of these losses was not a matter of chance. It was the inevitable consequence of a genetic trap. Each failed pregnancy was a sharp, sudden blow to the house. The wealth of an empire spanning multiple continents could not purchase a single healthy child. The strategy of locking power within the family had reached its most agonizing conclusion. They had secured their borders and their titles, but they had discarded their ability to produce the next generation. The nursery silence grew deeper, signaling that the dynasty was not just failing, but actively extinguishing itself. The obsession with blood purity had reached its final, logical wall. Centuries of calculated unions, designed to consolidate every acre of land and every ounce of gold, had folded the family tree until it snapped. The physicians stopped checking for signs of pregnancy. The courtiers stopped whispering about potential heirs. The realization settled over the palace like a heavy, suffocating frost. The dynasty was biologically inert. The very strategy intended to secure an eternal reign had stripped the family of its ability to reproduce. They had spent generations hoarding power, only to find that the vessel for that power had lost its function. There would be no next generation. No son would inherit the throne. No daughter would carry the name to a foreign court. The machinery of state continued to turn, but the source of its authority had run dry. It was the ultimate, bitter irony of the Habsburg experiment. By closing their doors to the world to keep their riches untainted, they had trapped themselves in a genetic dead end. The empire was still vast, yet it was now a hollow construct, waiting for the final collapse. The bloodline had spent its final reserves, and the silence in the halls was the sound of a total, irreversible extinction. The 1st of November, 1700. The candle flames in the royal chamber flickered against the damp stone walls, casting long, erratic shadows. Charles II lay motionless. His chest, which had spent decades fighting for air, finally stilled. The physician leaned forward, pressed 2 fingers against the monarch's throat, and pulled back. He offered no words, only a slow, deliberate nod to the men waiting in the doorway. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was a physical weight. It pressed into the velvet curtains, the gilded moldings, and the cold floors of the palace. For the first time in centuries, the heartbeat of the Spanish Habsburgs had ceased. Outside, the news had not yet reached the streets of Madrid, but within the inner sanctum, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt thin, drained of its purpose. The servants stopped their work. The guards turned their eyes toward the floor. The entity that had commanded an empire was gone, and in its place remained only a void. The dynasty had reached its terminus. The candle flames died out one by one, leaving the room in darkness, marking the absolute end of an era that had once spanned the globe. The stillness lasted only as long as it took for the news to hit the city gates. Then, the silence shattered. It began with a single, rhythmic strike on a snare drum from the plaza. Then another. Within minutes, the sound of marching boots replaced the quiet of the palace halls. The Spanish succession crisis did not wait for the mourning period to end. It erupted with the force of an avalanche. Couriers sprinted through the corridors, their heavy boots clattering against the marble, carrying urgent missives to foreign embassies. The vacuum left by the king had become a magnet for every hungry power in Europe. Diplomats scrambled to secure claims, while generals began the grim work of mobilizing their regiments. The calm of the inner sanctum was swept away by the rising tide of ambition and steel. Flags were unfurled, swords were drawn, and the city of Madrid transformed from a site of royal passing into the epicenter of a continental tremor. The era of the Habsburgs had ended, and in its wake, the drums of war began their relentless, thundering beat. The transition was absolute. Where once there was a dynasty, there was now only the cold, sharp reality of a continent preparing for total confrontation. The drums in Madrid were only the prelude. Within months, the infection of war spread from the Iberian Peninsula to the furthest reaches of the continent. Great powers collided in a decade-long frenzy, turning the fields of Europe into a vast, churning slaughterhouse. Every village became a strategic coordinate. Every river became a border to be defended with iron and fire. The conflict did not respect the old boundaries of the Habsburg Reach. It tore through them. Soldiers waded into marshes and scaled fortress walls, their movements dictated by the desperate race to fill the power vacuum. Thousands fell, their lives spent to redraw the lines of influence that the Habsburgs had once held with such brittle pride. In the war rooms, generals traced routes on parchment with steady hands, while miles away, the reality was smoke, screaming, and the relentless thud of artillery. The map of the world was not shifted by diplomacy, but by the weight of bodies and the exhaustion of empires. By the time the dust settled, the geography of power had been permanently altered. The blood of a generation served as the ink for the new treaties, a brutal testament to the price of an empty throne and the terrifying momentum of a collapsing dynasty. The sun set on the Habsburgs not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow, inevitable retreat into the shadows. As the smoke of conflict dissipated, the once hallowed halls of the Spanish court felt hollow, stripped of their ancient gravity. The portraits that lined the galleries seemed to watch in silence as the new order took root. Bourbon agents arrived in Madrid with lists and ledgers, systematically dismantling the remnants of a legacy that had spanned centuries. They moved through the chambers with clinical efficiency, replacing old seals and burning outdated decrees. Where once there was the rigid, suffocating atmosphere of the Habsburg court, there was now the brisk, unfamiliar energy of a new era. The old guard watched from the periphery. Their influence evaporated, their titles rendered obsolete by the shifting tides of authority. It was a transition marked by a quiet, lingering melancholy. The grandeur that had once defined an empire was being packed away, stored in the dusty corners of forgotten archives. One by one, the symbols of the old dynasty were lowered or removed, replaced by the rising crests of the Bourbons. The transition was complete. The house that had held the world in its grip for generations had finally let go, leaving behind only the echo of a name and the cold, empty spaces where their power once stood. History offers few warnings as severe as the fate of the Habsburgs. They sought to command the globe by bolting every window and barring every door, convinced that hoarding their bloodline would preserve their dominion forever. Instead, they built a tomb. The very walls they raised to keep the world out became the cage that trapped them within. They traded the vitality of new alliances for the stagnant comfort of the familiar, watching as their influence withered under the weight of their own isolation. Their legacy is not found in the maps they redrew or the gold they amassed, but in the silence of their final, empty chambers. It stands as a testament to a simple, brutal truth. A dynasty that refuses to look outward eventually loses the capacity to survive. They fought to protect a name, a title, and a lineage, only to find themselves consumed by the very structure they built. Now, only the dust remains in the halls of the Alcazar. The grand experiment of blood and border is over. What endures is the echo of a lesson learned too late. Those who build their world behind closed doors ensure that, in the end, they will be the only ones left to witness its ruin. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe so my channel can grow. It will help me a lot. Take care.